The image that broke the story open was not a legal document. It was not a palace press release or a carefully worded statement read out by a spokesman. It was an empty chair, a single empty chair at a state reception that communicated more than any official announcement could have, because Queen Camilla was not sitting in it. And the reason she was not there was that she had just walked out of a council meeting where something had been confirmed about her future, quietly, formally, and with the full weight of institutional authority behind it. She had not been divorced. She had not been stripped of her title or removed from the building. But she had been separated from everything the crown would become after Charles, so completely that every piece of influence she had spent decades building would stop the moment her husband's reign ended. The part that nobody had expected was this. Charles had known it was coming before she walked into the room. Before going into the timeline, the private meetings, and the handwritten notes that set all of this in motion, it is worth being precise about what the Royal Household Council actually is. It is the group of senior officials and family members who handle urgent institutional matters behind closed doors, away from the public ceremonies and the press briefings and the official calendar. When this group gathers to confirm something, it is not a discussion, it is a settlement. And what they confirmed that afternoon was that Camilla would hold no place in the monarchy's future line of institutional continuity. That phrase requires unpacking, because it is the kind of language that sounds technical until you understand what it takes away. She keeps the title. She keeps the duties, the public appearances, the role beside Charles. None of that changes. What changes is everything that was supposed to survive beyond his lifetime. Succession-related authority, any role in an emergency regency, and every protection that might have carried her influence forward after his death. The order did not end her marriage or remove her crown. It did something colder than either of those things. It said that no power connected to her position could pass to her children, her relatives, her household advisors, or her personal charitable foundation. Every year of work she had put in would remain visible in the historical record. None of it would become permanent. The Lord Chamberlain finished reading the document aloud, and Camilla did not argue. She did not demand an explanation or turn to Charles and ask him to say something in her defense. She pushed back her chair, removed the palace briefing folder from her lap, placed it on the table, and walked toward the doors while the room watched in silence. Before she reached them, she turned toward Charles and waited. Just a beat. She was expecting him to challenge the ruling, to reject the document, to say her name. He lowered his eyes to the papers in front of him. That small movement told her what no one in that room had said out loud. He had known. He had known before she entered. Camilla closed the folder with careful hands. She said, "You have already decided who I am." She placed the file on the table, rose before Charles could answer, and walked out with her composure fully intact, which is its own kind of statement about what she was feeling underneath it. The detail that tells you the most about the other person in that room is that William did not move. He did not look satisfied, and he did not look surprised. His stillness was the stillness of someone who had been prepared for exactly this outcome. Charles noticed it. As the doors closed behind his wife, the Lord Chamberlain held a second sealed page under one hand. That document named the royals who would take on every responsibility Camilla had just lost. Charles looked at his son and asked how long he had been preparing for this. That question was the fracture. Behind the palace announcement stood three people connected by love, duty, and memories none of them could walk away from. All three believed they were defending the monarchy. Camilla saw the decision as the destruction of everything she had spent decades working to secure. Charles understood it as a punishment he had failed to prevent. William saw something different, a boundary drawn around the future crown before anyone else could draw it for him. Only one of them would determine what the monarchy became. Camilla had spent years turning her position into something durable. She had done it through charitable work, through household appointments, through ceremonial duties, and through a level of access to the king that gave her more than status. It gave her a network, people, commitments, relationships inside the royal system that were supposed to carry forward. The new order threatened to reduce all of that to a temporary arrangement, something permitted during Charles's reign, and denied any continuation beyond it. The work would count. The influence would expire. That distinction is brutal when you sit with it. She could do everything that was asked of her, support the king through everything, build a genuine legacy in the areas she cared about, and none of it would outlast her husband's heartbeat. William was carrying a different weight. As the direct heir, he had started examining every existing arrangement through a single question. What would survive into his reign? He had begun to worry that private agreements connected to Camilla, her household, or the network she had built could become obligations he had never agreed to. The decision was not revenge, at least not in how he articulated it to himself. It was a boundary, a line around Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis that protected them from inheriting commitments they had not made and could not undo. When you step back, that is a reasonable institutional concern. Informal privileges and advisory roles and charitable networks allowed to continue automatically from one reign to the next are not neutral. They are someone else's power structure being handed forward without consent. Charles sat alone in the council chamber after the others left. He put one hand on the empty chair beside him. The king loves his wife. Nobody who has watched them seriously disputes that, but he also understood that his son's concerns could not simply be dismissed. Choosing to ignore William could have produced a constitutional conflict between the reigning monarch and the future one, a split powerful enough to damage the institution before the succession had even begun. So Charles was caught. Protecting his wife and ensuring a stable handover to his son had become mutually exclusive, and he had to choose. Camilla sat in her private room with the unsigned briefing papers in front of her. She removed a small royal brooch and placed it beside the folder. She was angry with William, but the deeper wound was something she directed at Charles. He had let her walk into that room without a word of warning. He had allowed her to hear the decision in front of staff and officials and other family members. That is not a policy disagreement. That is a husband letting his wife be ambushed. William was reviewing the confidential draft in a separate room, and several duties had been marked for transfer to Catherine. The scope of the changes was larger than Camilla had initially understood when she read the document in the council chamber. Then Charles found a private note showing he had fought to soften the original proposal and preserve at least some of her ceremonial role. Camilla sent him one handwritten message. Come without your aids. Tell me whose decision this truly was. The confrontation was coming, but its roots ran back 6 weeks to a Windsor meeting where one sentence had turned suspicion into open resistance. That meeting had not started as a confrontation. Camilla had entered expecting approval for what she described as a straightforward administrative arrangement. She proposed creating a continuity role, a temporary consultative function designed to keep palace operations stable during the transition between one reign and the next. Her argument was that her private office could provide guidance on charities, staff, and ceremonial commitments during the period of national mourning before William had fully assumed control. To her, it was practical. To William, reading the supporting clause, it looked like authority designed to survive its natural limit. He reached the relevant section and read it twice. The provision allowed advisors from Camilla's charitable foundation to continue working from royal premises for 12 months after the current reign ended. William asked, plainly, why people chosen by his stepmother should remain inside the palace after he became monarch, his voice stayed level. The substance of the question was not. Charles immediately defended his wife. Years of service had earned her respect, and a dignified transition, he argued. He reminded William of what she had carried, the public criticism, the duties others had declined, the years of standing beside him when the institution needed stability. William did not dispute any of that. He answered that dignity was not the same thing as inherited authority, and Charles suddenly had to hold in the same moment his marriage and his succession, which were pulling in opposite directions. Camilla slid the draft toward William across the table. She said the crown did not begin again simply because the throne changed hands. William closed the document and pushed it back. Under him, it must. That exchange was the point of no return. William quietly commissioned a confidential audit after that meeting, a private review designed to map every informal privilege that might continue beyond Charles's reign without the next sovereign's approval. Princess Anne entered the picture at that stage. She joined the discussions and sent William a documented private memorandum warning that blurred lines of authority could create rival loyalties within the household and weaken whoever held the throne. Her involvement changed the weight of the review considerably. Officials could not characterize it as personal resentment from the heir when the Princess Royal was backing it with formal written advice and her own documented reasoning. Camilla learned about the review 3 days before the emergency meeting. She found the phrase Operation Clearline inside a misfiled household schedule and understood that William had moved past resistance into something more concrete. By the time she summoned Charles alone, the argument had shifted. It was no longer about a single clause in a draft document. It was about whether he had protected his wife or surrendered her future without telling her. Charles went to Camilla's sitting room without an equerry or private advisor. She stood beside the fireplace with the palace document open in both hands. Several seconds passed without either of them speaking. Then she asked whether he had known. He hesitated. The hesitation answered everything. What followed was not a constitutional discussion. It was a confrontation between a husband who had compromised and a wife who had just learned the man she had defended longest had allowed the crown to erase her while she was still in the building. Charles admitted he had received the final recommendation 48 hours earlier. He said he had spent those 2 days trying to soften the language, protect her ceremonial position, and prevent the order from becoming a complete exclusion. He insisted he had fought for her. She heard that he had fought in silence, which amounts to the same thing as not fighting at all. Camilla rejected the distinction immediately. Standing beside Charles at ceremonies was not protection if every aspect of her authority disappeared the moment his reign ended. She was being asked to continue performing every visible part of the role while the institution quietly emptied out everything that gave the role continuity. She stepped closer and pressed the document against his chest. "You let them erase me while asking me to keep smiling beside you." Charles held the folder but could not answer straight away. Then he said the thing he had been most afraid to say. If he had rejected the recommendation, he risked losing William's participation in succession planning entirely. The private process that prepares the heir to take full control had to continue, and William's cooperation in that process was not optional. He had chosen unity with his son because a fractured succession could damage the monarchy at its most vulnerable moment. He knew it would wound Camilla. He had made that choice anyway. Camilla asked whether William had written the final clause. Charles said no, but something in his face gave the more complete answer. The prince had insisted on its central principle. Nothing connected to her private network would carry forward automatically into his reign. Then Charles disclosed the final pressure. Anne had warned him, in a documented conversation recorded in his briefing notes, that two rival centers of loyalty inside the household could tear the family apart during a succession. That warning had persuaded him the review could not be stopped. Camilla removed the small crown-shaped pin Charles had given her after their coronation. She placed it beside his hand and said she would not attend the evening reception. Charles looked at the pin, then at his wife. He told her he would go to William personally, not to reverse the decision, but to find out how far the restructuring had already gone. William was not waiting in a grand chamber. He was in a small palace office with 2 folders and a handwritten list on the desk. The simplicity of it unsettled Charles more than ceremony would have. This was not resistance performed for an audience. It was a plan that had already been completed. The prince had worked through appointments, residences, foundations, advisory privileges, and private access arrangements. Camilla's removal from the royal line was not the whole of the decision. It was the first consequence that had become visible. William understood the current limits of his position. As heir, he could not rewrite Charles's reign, remove Camilla from her present duties, or issue commands to the monarch's household. Succession planning gave him a different kind of reach. He could refuse to inherit informal commitments and draw a clear line between temporary permissions and responsibilities the future crown would be expected to continue. Anne's documented advice had given that position its credibility. She believed continuity should protect the institution, not preserve the personal networks built around one figure within it. Her support made the case for the boundaries look disciplined rather than personal, and made it much harder for Charles to dismiss. Charles looked at his son and asked the question he had been carrying since he left Camilla's room. Was this genuinely about constitutional clarity, or was it old anger wearing the language of duty? William's jaw tightened. Both men understood what had been named. The past had not disappeared. It had learned to sit quietly inside every conversation about the future. William did not apologize. He said he would not allow George, Charlotte, and Louis to begin their public lives inside arrangements made before they were old enough to understand them. Charles heard no cruelty in that. The absence of cruelty made the finality harder to argue with. Before the meeting, Catherine had asked William whether protecting the crown required publicly humiliating Camilla in front of the household. He had paused before answering. He still believed the decision was right. He could not entirely deny that the walkout had become something harder than the policy itself. William opened the second folder. The sealed page named Catherine and Anne as joint recipients of the transition responsibilities Camilla had lost, with final authority resting with the reigning monarch or direct heir. Charles read it once, then again. One power remained his alone. The restructuring could not take full effect until he signed the implementation order, the document that turned the plan into binding palace action. William had won the argument. Charles still controlled the pen. The monarch carried the order to his private office. Camilla's empty chair was across the room, where she normally sat during their evening briefings. No advisor came in. No phone rang. Charles sat with the fountain pen uncapped beside his hand for nearly 3 hours. When he finally reached for it, he was not choosing between right and wrong. He was choosing which relationship the monarchy could survive losing. Camilla's office had already been frozen, while the document sat unsigned. Staff could not approve long-term appointments, continuity agreements, or commitments intended to outlast the current reign. Every delayed signature left the palace between 2 systems, the Queen's present authority and the boundaries William intended to enforce. Palace secretaries had begun reorganizing quietly. Transition files were moved from Camilla's office into a secure cabinet shared by William, Catherine, and Anne, meaning she was already being separated from the future before the ink made it official. Charles signed slowly. He stopped briefly before finishing his name. He understood that his signature protected the succession. He also understood it confirmed the thing his wife had feared most. When forced to choose, he had placed the crown's future above hers. Camilla returned briefly to collect her personal papers. She opened the continuity cabinet and found it empty. A courtier explained the files had been moved under royal instruction. She thanked him calmly and waited until he left the room. Then she steadied herself against the edge of the desk with both hands. She sent word she would not accompany Charles to the evening reception. Catherine refused when officials offered her Camilla's place beside the king. The Princess of Wales said the transition should not look like one woman's victory over another. She would accept future responsibility when the time came. She would not make humiliation into celebration. Anne stepped forward instead, attending beside her brother and offering stability without appearing to displace his wife. Charles noticed all evening that attention kept returning to the empty chair. Anne understood the absence said more than any prepared statement. Late that night, Camilla sent William a private request. She wanted to meet him the following morning, without Charles, without Catherine, without Anne, and without any staff in the room. The signature had made the decision official. She intended to face the man who had made it unavoidable. She was already there when William entered. No folders sat between them. No advisor waited behind the doors. For the first time since the crisis began, they faced each other not as competing offices, but as two people shaped by the same family and divided by the same history. She did not ask him to reverse the order. She asked why he believed it had been necessary. Camilla set aside the legal argument first. She told him she understood his right to reject commitments that would extend into his reign without his consent. What she could not accept was the suggestion that her years beside Charles had created nothing with a legitimate place in royal history. She had endured public hostility that would have broken most people. She had carried duties during years when the monarchy needed steadiness and the public was not offering any. To make her future influence disappear was one thing. To make her service look temporary and disposable was something else entirely. William answered carefully. The order did not remove her marriage, her title, her public work, or her position beside Charles. It created a boundary around the next reign. That boundary existed because no private household, no family advisor, and no charitable network should inherit access to the crown automatically when sovereignty passed to a new person. He was protecting the office. He was not rewriting her past. Camilla heard the distinction. The deeper wound remained. She told him she had lived for years, knowing he would never fully trust her. The walkout had not happened because of one clause in one document. It had happened because Charles had stayed silent while that distrust became palace policy. In that moment, even her husband had appeared to decide that suspicion mattered more than loyalty. William did not defend the cruelty of the process. He admitted the announcement should never have been delivered without warning. He still believed the decision itself was right, but he accepted that constitutional clarity had been turned into personal humiliation. That admission changed the atmosphere. Then Camilla offered something nobody had predicted. She would dissolve the disputed continuity office herself and surrender every post-reign privilege connected to her network. In exchange, the palace would record the outcome as a voluntary act of service rather than an expulsion. William agreed to amend the public declaration. It would formally recognize her work throughout Charles's reign, while confirming that her authority ended with his sovereignty. Her legacy would remain. Her influence would not become hereditary. Camilla slid the original order across the table. William placed the amended page beside it. After a long silence, she picked up the pen and signed the voluntary renunciation. The prince told her the revised declaration would be announced that afternoon. She looked at him and said this time she would not walk away. Their agreement transformed the crisis, but the world had already seen her leave. Now the palace had to explain why she had chosen to return. By early morning, footage of Camilla's car leaving Buckingham Palace without Charles had reached broadcasters. Newspaper editors were preparing special editions. Commentators disagreed about the meaning of the decree, and people were gathering outside the gates. The most significant image was still coming. Hours after appearing publicly defeated, the Queen returned to the same palace entrance, this time beside William, carrying the amended declaration she had signed herself. Broadcasters described an unprecedented rupture between the Queen and the succession. Some presented Camilla as the target of a cold institutional removal. Others argued William had done what any future monarch needed to do. Every version agreed on one thing. What had been a private family conflict had become a public spectacle. Charles remained out of sight. He canceled a private audience and stayed inside the palace. His absence allowed the story to grow beyond the constitutional question. Viewers were no longer only watching a royal institution manage a succession dispute. They were watching a husband who had not followed his wife out of the building, and a marriage that appeared to have bent beneath the weight of the crown. Camilla received sympathy from people who had questioned her for years. The image of her leaving alone had removed the distance that royal ceremony normally provides. People saw humiliation. They saw a woman absorbing rejection without the protection of the men beside whom she had served. William became the target of public anger. Catherine watched the coverage beside him and warned that silence would allow the country to mistake constitutional caution for personal cruelty. She knew he could protect the crown on paper and lose the public's trust in the same week. When a broadcaster announced Camilla's return, hundreds had gathered outside the gates. The crowd went quiet as she stepped from the car beside William. She held the amended declaration. She spoke with steady finality. She had voluntarily surrendered every authority extending beyond the king's reign. Service to the crown, she said, must never become ownership of its future. William remained beside her, accepting the criticism alongside the resolution. Then the palace doors opened, and Charles appeared alone, waiting for Camilla to cross the courtyard to him. The signed renunciation had ended the constitutional conflict. Whether the personal damage could be survived was a different question, one that no document could answer. Charles did not move toward her immediately. He waited beneath the arch as she crossed the space between them. William had stopped several steps back, giving husband and wife room to face the consequences without witnesses standing too close. Camilla had lost her claim to any lasting place inside the machinery of the future crown. Charles had lost the belief that love alone could protect her from succession. Neither had lost the final choice about what this moment would mean. Her position going forward was unambiguous. She would remain queen throughout Charles's reign. She would continue her ceremonial duties and the charitable work she had spent years building. But the final settlement drew a firm line. No office, no advisor, no privilege, and no authority connected to her would transfer automatically when William became king. William had secured the future line around Catherine and the direct succession, with Anne supporting the crown wherever stability required it. He had not removed Camilla from the present. He had prevented her private household and personal network from carrying inherited influence into his reign. Charles stepped toward his wife. He did not hide behind duty or defend the decision as something imposed on him. He said he should have warned her before the council meeting. Allowing her to hear the judgment in front of others had been cowardly, even if the constitutional boundary itself had been necessary. Camilla listened without interrupting. She told him she could forgive the decision more easily than she could forgive his silence. She did not take back the pin she had removed during their confrontation. That symbol belonged to the trust they had lost. She did reach for his hand. They walked back into the palace together. William gave her something that lasted longer than an apology. The final palace record described Camilla as having voluntarily placed the undisputed succession of the crown above the protection of her own future influence. That wording transformed the outcome. An exclusion became, in the official history, a final act of royal service. She returned to her usual chair at the next family council. No continuity files sat in front of her. The gap on the table was plain. Presence was not power, and she had not come back for power. William entered and met her eyes. He gave a restrained nod. She returned it. Charles opened the meeting, while Catherine and Anne held the transition documents that had once been managed from Camilla's office. The verdict had been reached. Camilla lost her place in the monarchy's future structure and kept her place in its present story. William protected the succession without forcing his father to abandon his wife. Charles discovered that love could not erase constitutional limits, only help the people inside them survive each other. The palace doors had closed behind Camilla in humiliation. When they opened again, she returned on different terms, not as someone who owned the crown's future, as a queen who had chosen its survival over her own.